What's up, YouTube? So it's day 4 of Road to Code, and we're still crushing it. Another super productive overnight shift. So we went over four modules last night actually, which is like half of the whole responsive web design certification, 300 hours, which I don't think it's going to take that long. We're on the last module now. That's what we completed last night. We completed the applied accessibility, responsive web design principles, CSS Flexbox, and CSS Grid. The applied accessibility, let me read off what we have done in this challenge. Well, actually, first of all, let me explain what I learned from it. So I was watching some YouTube videos before I did this, and the guy on YouTube, he was applying for a job, right, an interview, and it was actually for accessibility, like some kind of government website, and the job was to let handicapped people or visually impaired people, for them to be able to see, basically to help them see the website, etc. So I kind of had an idea of like, okay, I see the niche for it. So that's pretty interesting that I've seen that video, and then we learned how to do a bit of it in the curriculum here. So let's just read it off. Add a text alternative to images for visual impaired accessibility. Know when alt text should be left blank. Use headings to show hierarchical relationships of content. Jump straight to the content using the main element. Wrap content in the article element. Make screen reader navigation easier with the header landmark. Make screen reader navigation easier with the nav landmark. Make screen reader navigational easier with the footer landmark. Improve accessibility of audio content with the audio element. Improve chart accessibility with the figure element. Improve form field accessibility with the label element. Wrap radio buttons in a field set element for better accessibility. Add an accessibility date picker. Standardize times with the HTML5 date time attribute. Make elements only visible to a screen reader by using custom CSS. Improve readability with high contrast text. Avoid color blindness issues with using sufficient contrast. Avoid color blindness issues by carefully choosing colors that convey information. Give links meaning by using descriptive link text. Make link navigatable with HTML access keys. Use tab index to add keyboard focus to an element. Use tab index to specify the order of keyboard focus for several elements. So that was all of the modules and questions in applied accessibility. And one thing that I noticed with that, the important piece is basically don't take shortcuts and make sure that it follows the order of how it's supposed to go, so that everything in the code is communicating effectively so it can be read correctly. And having it structured the right way makes it a lot more easier to help for accessibility. So the next one after that was the responsive web design principles. This was really short. There's only like 5 things in the module here. Create a media query. Make an image responsive. Use a render image for higher resolution displays. Make a typography responsive. I can't pronounce it right now. But yeah, I know this one was about just making things work in the code for when you resize the page, your browser, that everything is still working correctly, and just sizing it up to make sure that it follows the change in dimensions accordingly. So after that was the CSS Flexbox. This was an interesting one. I mean, definitely interesting. Let me read it off and then I'll give my thoughts on it. So the things that we completed in the module were use display, flex to the position, 2 boxes, add flex superpowers to the tweet embedment, use the flex direction property to make a row, apply the flex direction property to create rows in the tweet embed, use the flex direction property to make a column, apply the flex direction property to create a column in the tweet, Align elements using the justify content property. Use the justify content property in the tweet embedment. Align elements using the align items property. I use the align items property in the tweet embedment. Use the flex wrap property to wrap a row or column. Use flex shrink property to shrink items. Use the flex grow property to expand items. Use the flex bias property to set the initial size of an item. Use the flex shorthand property. Use the order property to rearrange items. And then last is use the align self property. So this was an interesting one just for the fact that you're basically editing the page. If you literally like picture a box, like it's just funny. It's called CSS flex box, and you're literally positioning things to fit within that box, but it's more like a rectangle, really. And yeah, you're just basically using code to like position things in a certain way within that box that it's in, which was interesting indeed. And then right after that, the follow-up with that was CSS grid, which was definitely a nice follow-up with the flexbox, so they are like both interconnected with functionality. And to read it off, what we completed in this module was create your first CSS grid, add columns with grid template columns, add rows with grid template rows, use CSS grid units to change the size of the columns and rows, create a column gap using grid column gap, create a row gap using grid row gap, add gaps faster with grid gap, use grid column to control spacing, use grid row to control spacing, align an element horizontally using justify self, align an item vertically using align self, align all items horizontally using justify items, align all items vertically using align items, divide the grid into an area template, place items in grid areas using the grid area property, use grid area without creating any areas template, reduce repetition using the repeat function, limit item size using the min max function, create flexible layouts using autofill, create flexible layouts using autofit, use media queries to create responsive layouts, and last but not least was create grids within grids. Now this was very interesting. The CSS grids just basically it's like the flex box, but instead of the large rectangle box, it's like split up into 4x4 squares on a page, and you're making adjustments to any of the cell boxes in the grid. What's interesting about this is I was actually watching a YouTube series, crash course about computer science, and the way that they were describing basically how CPU works and getting data from the RAM to the CPU is basically what they were explaining looked like a CSS grid where it's where the RAM basically was looking for an address. When it looks for an address, it basically goes through like a grid. Well, it's basically like a city with streets, and each of the street is an address, but the address, instead of how we say our street names like 8 or whatever, it's done in the binary number, the binary system, and basically it moves like in a grid like motion. Like the streets are the grid and the grid is the streets, so is in the city. So that was interesting to see how that interconnected with what I was learning in the freecodecamp, and then seeing the crash course of computer science series, which is a really well done series so far. I haven't seen all of it yet, but that's what I'm doing on my free time as well, is watching that. But yeah, just seeing how it was like, okay, that clicks, like that's similar to coding, and they were explaining coding a bit too. But yeah, that was day 4. Definitely crushed it. I mean, went through 4 out of 8 modules. That's literally half of the curriculum and overnight. So yeah, yet again, it was a productive overnight. and we just have one more module in responsive web design projects to finish. But yeah, that was my update for day 4. Again, if you're enjoying this series, just like, comment, and subscribe. And yeah, just peace out. See you guys next time.